what can you tell me about the Vancouver, shall we call it climate justice movement, or how do you call the environmental movement in Vancouver?
I think the interesting point is that it's not only an environmental movement, it's in a larger sense a political movement, a social movement, and it includes all ways of necessary protests and necessary things to change in a larger sense.
And
I think the difference between the environmental protests, ecological protests that started in Vancouver in the 1970s through Greenpeace and then later through particular struggles around logging or just forms of the extractive economy. What has changed in the last decade has been the influence of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of being that have led to a new set of protocols for protest and broadened the environmental movement in Vancouver to be one that recognizes more strongly recognizes the role of capitalism, but more strongly recognizes the role of colonialism and the ongoing colonial present of Canada. So it's built a broader political context for the movement. At the same time, it's been able to, I won't say universalize, but it's been able to expand an understanding of the ecology and of a relationship to the earth and a way of being in the world that expands past Western epistemology and really challenges the ways that we tend to think non-relationally within Western philosophies.
So it would be.
It's linking anti-gentrification movement to the problems of opioid crisis, drug policies, but also to the ongoing structural racism against racialized people, but very much also indigenous people. The absolute disaster of the missing and murdered women and indigenous people. So all of this is linked with the very careful and beautiful, you could say, way of how Indigenous elders mostly talk about how we need to care for the land and create a different way of being together and living together.
I would like to know how is the presence of the Indigenous movement inside the society of, for example, Vancouver. The presence of this movement in.
Just a few days ago, when we on the way to Düsseldorf, there was just the inner city. It was not very many people, but the main traffic artery was totally blocked by maybe about 100 people, and many of these protests. There's a mix of things to be criticized, and that was pipelines and logging of old growth forests, all different kinds of extractionist, capitalist movements, and most of the time is elder women lead the protests. So there is speeches and drumming and singing in the center of the protests, but then of course supported by a variety of young, engaged, also of course white folks around, but always led by elder women.
May I understand that these movements, that the Indigenous movement is linked physically to the white climate movement, so that they are together fighting? Is this right, or how is it structurally?
In a short way of saying that, I think, would be that if any climate struggle that takes anti-colonialism and decolonization seriously is linked with Indigenous resistance to capitalism and Indigenous struggle for land.
Yes, this is from content, from thinking. We are thinking here the same, but we don't have Indigenous people around in Germany. So we have now the visit of the Zapatistas, and it's like a huge impact. What I would like to know is if the Indigenous presence in Vancouver has it always been in the protest movement, or has it become stronger in the last time? Oh, I'm too loud. Has it become stronger in the last time? Or yes, and I would like to know how is there an impact to the white movement changing by this, so that there are other Schwerpunkte?
I think there is a big link, and I think I'm not quite sure, but I think through the history after the 80s and Greenpeace, it's by now all serious environmental protests also are led by Indigenous people, because it is also a decolonizing project. It's all land in Canada is colonized and is, belongs to Indigenous nations, and also it brings in more different understanding of how we relate to the land. So it's not about possession, and it's not about real estate, it's not about owning land, but it's about how we create different relations, and that's what Indigenous arguments bring into the environmental, or take over the environmental discussion.
I think if we take that phrase from globalization, the anti-globalization movement that said another world is possible, within that framework, it was another world was possible, but it was still imagined within a Western epistemology. So what has happened is that Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of being have opened up an expanded way of thinking of being in relationship to one another that has simultaneously provided a sharper critique. So the critique is around the ongoing colonialism in Canada, and of course the utter destruction of the extractive economy. And then we had a more expanded possibility that's come about because of the ways of being together that Indigenous knowledges present to us. So rather than continually being caught in a loop of proposing another world but not stepping outside of the imagination that thinks of that other world, Indigenous knowledges give us a way that completely shatter the Western epistemologies that guide how we treat one another.
Can you describe a little bit, because this is very interesting for me, for our practice here in Germany, because we do not until now had this physical impact. We have always this being connected in mind or in thinking, but this is something completely different than in the practice. Can you describe a little bit for me if white movements have been changing by this insight that white people have, like having more self-critics, not only not only talk about critical whiteness. This is, I don't mean this at all. I mean also between each other, because how we behave with each other in the white groups. Has there been a change?
Yes, because very many times we always identify ourselves now as settlers. So we are settlers, we are uninvited guests on Indigenous land. So we thank Indigenous as one of the protocols of what's happening now before we have public meetings or public events. So we make a land acknowledgement, which is not only a symbolic phrase, but it's quite meaningful how people think about it. So and this whole idea of decolonization, it's to start decolonizing your own role, your own understanding of Western ways of being, Western epistemologies, and ways of how we always think we know things better.
Another aspect that I think I would add to that is that, historically, on the left, we've triumphed moments of failure, which we transform into moments of success. And we also have a tendency to, because critique is so important as part of the process, that sometimes we get stalled at critique, and then that critique gets turned inward. So we have a kind of cycle of critique and failure that's then imagined as success. But Indigenous, when you add an Indigenous mode of being together and an Indigenous mode of relating to each other, I think what happens is that you have a different temporality is produced where relationships are built over time. The relationships are necessarily framed as being respectful. And that form of respect, I think, shapes how people treat each other individually and not how we treat each other differently as a group. So I see it being able to break some of the historical boxes that the left has built for itself, based on leftist notions of temporality and Western notions of critique. For instance, it wouldn't be cool just to jump on somebody and totally critique the hell out of them and smash them, because you're not only are you their comrade, you're in a different set of relationships and a different set of protocols with them. So when you've worked with Indigenous people, the first thing you did was necessarily made a set of complex, comprehensive protocols simply for working together. It was not assumed that there was an established way of working together.
Right. So in that way, it's a really interesting process of learning, of how to build this respectful relationship, and that we also have to spend time together. So we always also thank each other for labor which has to be done in building these relationships, which I didn't know so much from Europe, because so much is about effectiveness and let's get the things done. But to actually do that needs to build a lot of building relationships, and lots of hard labor is involved in that.
Yes. Part of the work that we've tried to do together is to critique a Western and leftist temporality where the future is going to be something that's born from ideas out of the past that have always been blocked by capitalism, such as the Paris Commune, which is on the map behind us. That'll come through to the future. So once we can free up the path for the imagined future that was devised in the past to come forward, that's where our society will be reshaped. Indigenous senses, because there's not a unified sense of temporality from in Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous temporalities don't have such a separation of the past, the present, and the future. They can exist simultaneously, so the goal and the outcome is a different form of temporality that necessarily makes you spend time together in a different way, and not to be I won't say goal-oriented, but to not diminish the potential and the value of spending time together, respectfully getting to know each other and finding, as they might say, a good way forward.
Ja, für mich persönlich hat sich das total geändert, wie ich jetzt zum Beispiel in Treffen mit Leuten, wie das moderiert wird. Wir kommen nicht sofort zur Sache, was es alles zu erledigen gibt, sondern was ich gelernt habe, dass man die erste Zeit, wenn man mit Indigenous Folks arbeitet, dass man zuerst mal wirklich die persönlichen, familiären Verhältnisse diskutiert. Also die Art und Weise, wie man gerade mit was man sich beschäftigt, wie in meinem Fall, wie es meiner Mutter geht. Also wir sprechen immer die erste Viertelstunde bei so Meetings immer über diese persönlichen Verhältnisse, bevor man dann sozusagen zur organisatorischen Sache kommt. Und das habe ich gelernt und das weiß ich mittlerweile auch sehr zu schätzen, weil es eine andere Verbindung herstellt. Es ist eine ganz andere Kommunikation und eine andere Art und Weise, wie man sich in der Welt bewegt und mit welchen Verhältnissen man sich sozusagen intensiv beschäftigt.
Macht ihr das auch untereinander? Also jetzt, wenn jetzt zum Beispiel nicht indigene Menschen nicht dabei sind, macht ihr das auch untereinander jetzt mehr?
Die Zeit, ja, sehr wohl. Also die Zeit, sich zueinander zu genehmigen quasi, das habe ich schon daraus gelernt. Also das hat sich auch in andere Gesprächsverhältnisse übertragen bei mir persönlich.
Ich habe eine vielleicht etwas simple Frage, und mich interessiert das irgendwie, wie lange das ungefähr schon so mehr, wie lange dieser Einfluss, wie alt ist dieser Einfluss, oder ist er relativ jung? Oder? Also
in der Intensität in den letzten Jahren, wie sich in Kanada so diese Resurgence von indigener Kunst, aber auch der ganzen Proteste Und mit diesem neuen indigenen Wissen, das so in den Vordergrund rückt auch. Also ich würde sagen, für mich persönlich in den letzten 3 Jahren hat sich da wirklich einiges getan. Also wie ich selbst über die Art und Weise, wie ich mich darin verhalte, wie sich das ändert. Es ist toll, dabei zu sein in so einem Prozess eigentlich und das mitzukriegen, eine vollkommen andere Perspektive.
Und dann erzähltet ihr, ich wollte es noch mal kurz ein bisschen hervorheben, dass der Protest in Vancouver, also der politische Protest, hauptsächlich auch wirklich geleitet wird von indigenen älteren Frauen. Ist das richtig?
Genau, also das ist schon so eine Autorität, dass bei sehr vielen dieser auch Pipeline, Deforestation oder Resource Extraction Proteste wird eigentlich immer, glaube ich, kann man sagen, von älteren Frauen, die sozusagen den Trommeln und Singen und sozusagen auch die moralische Kompetenz haben, das in einer intensiven Art und Weise zu prozessieren.
I'll add something that's a bit from one of your earlier questions, where, maybe earlier in the environmental movement, the protests were centered around saving the earth or saving the ecology, always for the future, always for the children. But I think today, the influence of the Indigenous movement, you can also add into that all environmental movements would be seen as protecting Indigenous culture, and so an extractive economy, logging, mining, and all of the economy that Canada has is seen as deeply colonial and deeply harmful to Indigenous culture. So as a young person being involved in the environmental movement in Canada, you would imagine yourself to be both making an argument for the sustainability of the earth, but also for the continued resurgence of Indigenous culture. So it adds another important aspect to what can be a more abstract aspect to environmental protest. To go to your other question, how the influence of Indigenous knowledge is, particularly in protest culture and in political organizing, has influenced me. I think it's deeply affected me in how decisions are made and how decisions have to be made collectively in a different manner. So one of the best slogans that have come out of this the last decade has come from Indigenous folks, which is "Nothing about us without us," which is an emphasis on non-hierarchical, process-based, ethical decision-making. And so many of our structures of decision-making in the West, and particularly institutionally, educationally, in the arts, etc., are often decisions are made that are not in discussion with the people who be the most affected. And I think that's been so central, that sense of authority to make a decision for a group or for a person without discussing, without coming to an agreement with them, has been the most universal, the most picked up, and the most useful aspect, in a sense, of the Indigenous resurgence that's happened over the last decade in Canada. I think also what it's done is it's changed the entire idea of how Canada is as a nation. Canada's always described itself as a friendly, multicultural nation. Now we see it's actually a deadly nation that deeply continues colonial structures, and those colonial structures, they're deadly. Lack of drinking water, lack of safe space, everything that Indigenous folks have to endure and have been enduring for a good 500 years, so to speak. So I think that the critique of colonialism has become a personal and a daily thing within Canada.